The official report is classified, buried under layers of ink so thick they bleed through the page. But whispers travel faster than jets. They slip through encrypted channels, haunt the smoky corners of debriefing rooms, and become legends told over cheap beer in forgotten VFW halls. The story of what happened over the Zagros Mountains isn't in any official record. It exists only in the memories of the men who were there, and in the ghost-like signature of a single aircraft that defied physics, weather, and a direct order to stand down. It all started with a sound that didn't belong. For SEAL Team 3, Kals and Mako huddled in a frozen ditch overlooking a suspected insurgent compound. The world had shrunk to the howling wind and the sting of ice on their faces. The storm had come out of nowhere, a meteorological bomb that had grounded every asset in the theater. Air support was a fantasy. Their exfil was a prayer. For 12 hours they had been ghosts, their presence unknown. But then came the sound. It wasn't the familiar, comforting roar of a friendly jet. It was a low, guttural hum, a vibration that seemed to come from the very rock beneath them. It grew, not in volume, but in presence, a pressure in the ears that made the teeth ache. The team's comms officer, Petty Officer Diaz, frantically scanned the frequencies. Nothing, no IFF transponder, no friendly call signs, nothing on the net. The sky above was a churning cauldron of black and gray, a solid ceiling of impenetrable cloud. Nothing could be flying in this. Nothing. The team leader, Lieutenant Commander Thorne, a man whose face was a roadmap of a dozen forgotten conflicts, peered through his thermal scope. The heat signatures in the compound below were agitated, moving with a purpose they hadn't shown before. They had heard it too. The humming intensified, and then, through a fleeting, impossible break in the clouds, they saw it. A silhouette, not a jet, not a helicopter. It was a shape that defied conventional aerodynamics, a series of sharp, intersecting angles that seemed to cut the air rather than fly through it. It was there for a heartbeat, a black-on-black phantom against the storm, and then it was gone. The humming faded, leaving only the shriek of the wind. A moment later, the compound's floodlights snapped on, sweeping the mountainside. Mako team was exposed. The mission, a simple reconnaissance, had just turned into a fight for survival. Miles away, at a forward operating base, the command center was in chaos. The storm had blinded them. Satellite feeds were useless. Drone coverage was zero. All they had was the intermittent, static-laced voice of Thorne reporting an unknown aerial contact and imminent enemy engagement. The request was desperate, immediate air support. The response from the air component commander was blunt and final. Negative. All birds are grounded. I'm not sending anyone up in this hurricane. Mako is on their own. That message, a death sentence delivered over a secure line, was when a single, unauthorized transmission cut through the command channel. The voice was calm, female, and laced with a faint, almost imperceptible southern drawl. Command, this is Ghost 1-1, I'm in the air. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm. There were no A-10s scheduled to fly. There were no pilots on standby. And there was no Calcian Ghost in the entire CENTCOM roster. The woman in the cockpit of the A-10C Thunderbolt II, tail number 810964, paid no mind to the frantic calls now flooding the net. Major Evelyn Ghost Reed was, for all intents and purposes, a phantom. Her name was on a roster, yes, but buried so deep in administrative leave and pending retirement paperwork that she had ceased to exist in the operational world. She was a relic, a veteran of conflicts the younger pilots only read about, a woman who flew the Warthog not because it was a stepping stone to sleeker, faster jets, but because she understood it. It was an extension of her own stubborn, resilient nature. The plane itself was a ghost, too. 964 was a boneyard bird, cannibalized for parts, slated for scrap, its systems a patchwork of old and new. Reed had spent the last 6 months, unofficially rebuilding it with a handful of aging, equally forgotten crew chiefs. They called it Christine, after the killer car in the old horror movie, because the damn thing just refused to die. When the storm hit and the official grounding order came down, Reed had seen the frantic intelligence chatter about Mako team. She knew what it meant. She had seen it before. Good men, stranded, with the wolves closing in. The official channels would debate. They would weigh risks. They would calculate acceptable losses. By the time they made a decision, there would be nothing left but bodies to recover. So she had made her own decision, a pre-flight check that existed only in her head, a taxi to a deserted auxiliary runway, and a takeoff roll that was more of a prayer than a procedure. Now, she was wrestling Christine through winds that threatened to tear the wings off. The A-10 wasn't built for grace. It was built to endure. It was a flying tank, and right now, it was bucking like a wild horse. Ice was forming on the canopy, and the sophisticated avionics that the younger pilots relied on were flickering, protesting the brutal conditions. Reed ignored them. She flew by feel, by the vibrations in the stick, by the groan of the airframe. It was a language she and the old plane understood. Mako actual, this is Ghost 1-1. She transmitted on the SEAL's frequency, her voice steady, despite the violent turbulence. Talk to me, where's the fire? The reply was laced with disbelief and desperation. Ghost 1-1, this is Mako actual. We are taking effective fire from a fortified compound. Grid coordinates to follow. Be advised, air support is negative. Who the hell are you? Reed banked the A-10, the G-force pressing her into her seat. Below, through the swirling snow and rain, she saw the muzzle flashes, tiny, angry sparks in the oppressive darkness. Let's just say, I'm a concerned citizen, Mako. I'm about 5 minutes out. Pop smoke on your position. I need to know where the good guys are. A plume of green smoke erupted on the mountainside, a fragile beacon in the chaos. It was dangerously close to the compound. The SEALs were pinned down, their backs to a sheer cliff. It was a killbox, solid copy on the green smoke, Reed said. Ghost 1-1 is inbound. Angels 1. She was flying low, dangerously low, using the terrain to mask her approach from whatever primitive radar the insurgents might have. The compound was a sprawling makeshift fortress, a collection of mud brick buildings surrounded by a high wall. Technicals with heavy machine guns were positioned at the corners, spitting tracers into the night. Reed's eyes, honed by thousands of hours in the air, took it all in. She saw the firing positions, the command building, the likely ammunition storage. She wasn't just a pilot, she was a hunter. Her weapon was a 30mm cannon that fired depleted uranium shells at a rate of 4,200 rounds per minute. The sound it made was not a gunshot. It was a roar, a tearing of the fabric of the sky. The insurgents below had no idea what was coming. They had been told no planes could fly. They felt safe, emboldened by the storm. They were wrong. Reed lined up her first pass. The heads-up display flickered, the targeting computer struggling to get a lock in the blizzard. She switched to manual, her thumb hovering over the trigger on the control stick. Mako go Winchester on my mark, she said, her voice dropping to a low, focused calm, coming in hot. Coming in hot. The A-10 screamed out of the storm clouds, its distinctive twin engines whining like banshee. For the men on the ground, it was a sound from heaven. For the men in the compound, it was the apocalypse. Reed squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon erupted. The sound, bruit, was visceral, a physical force that shook the very air. A stream of incandescent death, a laser beam of destruction, tore across the compound. The lead technical exploded in a ball of fire, the shockwave momentarily silencing the storm. She pulled up the A-10 clawing for altitude, and banked hard. For another run, the insurgents were in chaos, their disciplined fire turning into a panicked spray of bullets into the empty sky. They were shooting at a ghost. Good hits, Ghost. Good hits. Thorne yelled into his radio, a crack of hope in his voice. They're running. Hit the main building. Roger that, Mako Reed replied, her breathing even, her focus absolute. She rolled in again, this time ignoring the machine guns and focusing on the largest structure. She pickled a pair of Maverick missiles. The missiles streaked through the snow, guided by a laser she could barely see, and slammed into the building. The resulting explosion was massive, turning the structure into a crater of fire and rubble. The secondary explosions told her she'd hit their ammunition. The fight was over. The remaining insurgents were fleeing into the mountains, swallowed by the storm. Silence descended, broken only by the wind and the crackle of flames. Reed circled the compound once more, her thermal sensors picking up no signs of organized resistance. Mako, you guys look clear, she said. What's your status? Status is green, Ghost, Thorne replied, his voice thick with emotion. We're all in one piece, thanks to you. We owe you one. We owe you everything. Who are you? Reed looked out at the storm, at the endless, violent sea of clouds. She thought about her career, the years of service, the friends she'd lost, the quiet retirement that awaited her. She wasn't supposed to be here. By every rule in the book, she should be on the ground, safe. But the rules hadn't accounted for the men in that ditch. They hadn't accounted for her. Just a ghost, she said softly, keying her mic. Just a ghost in the machine. Now, let's talk about getting you boys home. The problem was, home was hundreds of miles away, across a mountain range and through a storm that was only getting worse. And she had just announced her presence to every hostile and friendly force in the region. Landing was not an option. Her fuel was critical. The Ghost had appeared, but now, it had nowhere to go. The command center at Bagram Airfield was a study. In controlled panic, on the main screen, a single unauthorized aircraft icon blinked defiantly. It was an A-10, flying a lazy circle over a set of coordinates that corresponded with Mako Team's last known position. The storm, represented by angry, swirling red and yellow polygons, engulfed the entire region. Every other aircraft icon was grayed out, sitting uselessly on tarmacs across Afghanistan and the Persian Gulf. The air component commander, a two-star general named Wallace, stared at the screen, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. "Get me a goddamn identity on that pilot," he barked at the room of controllers and intelligence officers. Now, the calls had already been made. Wing commanders were woken up, flight rosters triple-checked. The tail number 810964 initially drew a blank. It was listed as non-operational, inactive, a scrap heap. Then, a grizzled master sergeant in maintenance control, sipping coffee from a stained mug, remembered. "Sir," he said over the phone to a frantic colonel, "that's one of Major Reed's projects. The hog she's been tinkering with." The name meant nothing to Wallace, but it sent a ripple of recognition through the older NCOs and officers in the room. Evelyn Reed, Ghost Reed, a legend from the early days of the Desert Wars. A pilot who had flown the A-10 when it was still considered an ugly, unwanted stepchild of the Air Force. She had more combat hours in the Warthog than any 3 active duty pilots combined. She was also a notorious maverick, a woman who bent rules to their breaking point and had a file thick with commendations and reprimands in equal measure. She had been quietly shuffled off to a non-flying role, a desk job meant to usher her gracefully into retirement. No one had expected her to literally rebuild a condemned jet and fly it into a hurricane. She did what? Wallace roared, his voice echoing in the cavernous command center. The absurdity of the situation was matched only by its gravity. She had saved a SEAL team, yes, but she had also broken every protocol in the book. She had taken a non-airworthy craft, without authorization, into impossible weather conditions. If she went down, the inquiry would be a nightmare. If she made it back, Wallace wasn't sure which was worse. His immediate problem was more practical. Reed was low on fuel, her aircraft was likely damaged by the extreme weather, and there wasn't a single airfield within her range that wasn't completely socked in. The storm had shut down the world. Ghosts 1-1, this is Warlock, the command center's primary controller transmitted, his voice tight, "State your fuel and intentions." Reed's voice came back, as calm as if she were ordering a coffee. "Warlock, Ghost 1-1, my fuel state is suboptimal. Intentions are to find a patch of clear sky and a friendly piece of pavement. Got any suggestions?" The controller looked at his screen. The weather overlay was a solid wall of red. "Negative, Ghost. All regional airfields are reporting 0 visibility, severe icing, and wind shear. I can't clear you for an approach anywhere." This was the crux of it. She was trapped. She could try to fly above the storm, but her fuel wouldn't last. She could try to find a hole, but there were no holes. The only other option was to point the nose east, towards the desolate plains, and eject. The A-10 would be lost, and a pilot, ejecting into a blizzard in hostile territory, had a survival expectancy measured in hours, if not minutes. The SEALs on the ground listened to the exchange, their own relief now tinged with a cold dread. They were safe, but their savior was in a flying coffin. "Ghost, this is Mako Actual," Thorne transmitted, his voice heavy. "Is there anything we can do from down here?" "Negative, Mako," Reed replied, her tone betraying a hint of weariness for the first time. "You boys just stay warm." "Warlock, what about the tanker tracks? Is there a gas station up here anywhere?" The controller checked again. The KC-135 tankers, the flying gas stations that kept the air war going, had been the first to be recalled. They were sitting on the ground hundreds of miles away. "That's a negative, Ghost. No tankers, airborne." A young lieutenant in the corner of the command center, an intelligence analyst, suddenly spoke up. "Sir, there might be one option. It's unconventional." All eyes turned to him. He pointed to a small, isolated airstrip on the map, deep in a valley on the Pakistani border. It was a semi-abandoned CIA outpost, a relic of an earlier, murkier phase of the war. It was designated Shade Tree. "It's not an official airfield, sir," the lieutenant said, "but the agency keeps a small team there. It has a runway, short, unlit, and probably covered in snow. But it's in a deep valley. The surrounding mountains might be blocking the worst of the wind at ground level. It's a long shot. Wallace considered it. Landing a state-of-the-art fighter jet at a clandestine spy base was a diplomatic incident waiting to happen. But landing a damaged A-10, in a blizzard, on a short, unlit runway, that wasn't a long shot, it was suicide. Have you got a better idea, Lieutenant? Wallace snapped. The young officer shrank back. Wallace keyed his mic. Ghost 1-1. Warlock. We have a possible divert. A strip called Shade Tree. I have the coordinates. Be advised, this is an unimproved unlit runway. Conditions on the ground are unknown. It is a high-risk approach. The decision is yours. There was a long pause. In the cockpit, Reed looked at her fuel gauge. The needle was kissing the red. The old engines of the A-10 were thirsty, and fighting the storm had burned fuel at an alarming rate. She looked at the coordinates for Shade Tree. It was at the very edge of her range. If she went for it and missed the approach, she wouldn't have enough fuel to go around. She wouldn't even have enough fuel to climb to a safe ejection altitude. It was a one-shot deal. A high-risk approach is better than no approach at all. Warlock, she finally said, send the data. Ghost 1-1 is heading for the trees. The flight to Shade Tree was a brutal, soul-crushing battle against the elements. The A-10, already stressed, protested with every gust of wind. Alarms blared intermittently in the cockpit. As systems failed, reset, and failed again, Reed flew with a singular focus, her entire world shrinking to the glowing green line of her flight path on the navigation display and the feel of the stick in her hand. She was no longer just flying the plane, she was willing it to stay in the air. She spoke to it, coaxing it, whispering promises of rest and repair. It was a conversation between two old warriors, both battered, both refusing to quit. On the ground, Mako team had been ordered to a nearby extraction point where a special operations helicopter would attempt a daring pickup, but they refused to leave their radios. They huddled together, listening to the disembodied voice of the woman who had saved them as she fought for her own life. Miles above, they, more than anyone, understood the odds. They had lived their lives in the realm of high-risk, long-shot chances. They knew what it felt like to bet everything on a single, desperate roll of the dice. In the command center, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Every controller, every officer, was glued to the blinking icon of Ghost 1-1 as it crawled across the map. They were all pilots, or had been. They could imagine what Reed was going through. The ice, the turbulence, the gnawing fear that came with a dying machine and a fuel gauge on empty. The initial anger at her insubordination had evaporated, replaced by a growing, grudging respect. She was a madwoman, but she was a magnificent madwoman. Ghost 1-1, you are 5 miles from Shade Tree, the controller said, his voice hushed. We have no contact with the ground element there. You are on your own for this approach. Roger that, Warlock, Reed replied. Her voice was strained now, the effort of keeping the heavy jet under control audible. Tell my mother I love her. It was an old pilot's joke, black humor in the face of death, but it landed with a thud in the silent command center. She began her descent, a slow, careful spiral into the darkness of the valley. Her instruments were almost useless. The storm was playing havoc with the radar altimeter, giving her ghost readings. Her landing gear indicators flickered between red and green. She had no way of knowing if her wheels were actually down and locked. She was flying blind, aiming for a strip of pavement she couldn't see, in a place that officially didn't exist. She had to trust her instincts, the thousands of hours she had spent in this very seat, the muscle memory that was more reliable than any computer. She dropped her flaps, the plane shuddering in protest. The stall horn began to blare, a deafening, insistent shriek, telling her she was too slow, too close to the edge. She ignored it. She needed to be slow. She needed to kiss the ground, not slam into it. Through the swirling snow, she saw it, a faint dark line against the white, the runway. It was short, impossibly short. It looked like a driveway, and it was covered in a thick blanket of snow. Warlock, I have a visual on the strip, she said, her voice tight with concentration. It's not ideal. That was the understatement of the century. There were no approach lights, no runway markers, nothing but a stretch of asphalt in the middle of nowhere. She had one chance. She took a deep breath, her knuckles white on the control stick. Here we go, Christine, she whispered. One last ride. The A-10 descended, a gray ghost falling out of a gray sky. It was too fast. She knew it was too fast. But if she slowed any more, the wings would lose their lift and she would drop like a stone. She flared, pulling the nose up just before touchdown. The rear wheels hit the snow-covered asphalt. The plane slewed sideways, the tires finding no grip. The moment the A-10's wheels touched the runway at Shade Tree, all hell broke loose. The rubber, designed for pristine military-grade asphalt, found nothing but slick, compressed snow over a layer of ice. The aircraft, weighing over 25,000 pounds and still moving at nearly 140 knots, became a runaway freight train. Reed's world dissolved into a violent, screaming chaos of shuddering metal and the sickening screech of tires failing to find purchase. Her training took over. Instincts honed over 2 decades of flying kicked in. She slammed her feet on the rudder pedals, fighting the terrifying sideways skid. The nose of the Warthog swung violently to the left, aiming for a row of pine trees at the edge of the clearing. She applied full right rudder and differential braking, trying to wrestle the beast back into line. The anti-skid system, which would have helped on a normal runway, was useless here. It was like trying to steer on a frozen lake. The end of the runway was rushing towards her at an alarming speed. She was running out of room. The plane wasn't slowing down. In the command center, they heard it all. Her strained breathing, the groan of the airframe, the blare of the stall horn she'd been fighting, and then a sudden, sharp curse. Losing it. Then, silence. The icon for Ghost 1-1 blinked once, twice, and then vanished from the screen. A collective gasp went through the room. The controller, Warlock, stared at the empty space on the map where the icon had been. He keyed his mic, his hand trembling slightly. Ghost 1-1 Warlock. Radio check. Nothing. Ghost 1-1. Do you copy? The silence that answered was absolute, more terrifying than any scream. General Wallace slumped into his chair, the anger draining out of him, replaced by a hollow sense of loss. He had sent her to her death. He had given her an impossible choice, and she had taken it, and now she was gone. The legend of Ghost Reed had ended in a fiery wreck on a forgotten runway in the middle of a blizzard. For the men of Mako team, huddled around their radio miles away, the silence was a physical blow. They had been snatched from the jaws of death by a miracle, an angel in a warthog. Now, their angel had fallen. Lieutenant Commander Thorne bowed his head, the loss feeling as personal as if he had lost one of his own men. He never knew her name, never saw her face, but in that moment he felt a bond with the anonymous pilot forged in the crucible of combat. He owed her a debt that could never be repaid. But Evelyn Reed was not dead. In the cockpit, she was fighting with a ferocity that bordered on madness. As the jet careered off the runway and plowed into a deep snowdrift, the nose gear collapsed with a sickening crunch. The entire aircraft pitched forward, the giant GAU-8 cannon digging into the frozen earth. Snow and ice exploded upwards, completely engulfing the canopy, plunging her into a world of white blindness. The plane spun in a gut-wrenching 180-degree turn before finally, shuddering, it came to a halt. The silence that followed was profound. The storm still raged outside, but inside the cockpit there was only the sound of her own ragged breathing and the frantic ticking of the cooling engines. She was alive. She methodically began shutting down the systems, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. Electrical, hydraulics, fuel pumps, kill everything. The checklist was ingrained in her soul. Only when the cockpit was dark and silent, save for the faint glow of a single emergency light, did she allow herself to comprehend what had just happened. She had survived. The old plane, Christine, had held together. It was broken, perhaps beyond repair, but it had protected her. She leaned her head back against the ejection seat, a wave of exhaustion washing over her so powerful it felt like a physical weight. She was cold, bruised, and utterly spent. A flicker of movement outside the canopy caught her eye. Figures were emerging from the trees, moving cautiously towards the wrecked aircraft. They were dressed in winter gear, carrying rifles. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought they might be hostiles. But their movements were professional, disciplined. These were not insurgents. One of the figures raised a hand, signaling the others to hold position. He approached the cockpit, his face obscured by a snow-caked balaclava. He wiped at the ice on the canopy, peering in. Reed stared back. The man's eyes widened in surprise. He tapped on the glass and made a gesture. A thumbs up. Reed, her body aching, slowly returned the gesture. A moment later, the canopy lock hissed and the heavy plexiglass shell lifted, letting in a blast of frigid air and swirling snow. "Ma'am," the man said, his voice muffled by his mask, "you have got to be the craziest son of a bitch I have ever seen. Welcome to Shade Tree." It turned out the CIA team on the ground had heard her approach. They had assumed it was one of their own clandestine cargo planes in trouble and had prepared for the worst. The sight of a fully armed A-10 Warthog sliding sideways out of a blizzard was, to put it mildly, not what they had been expecting. Their medic checked her over. Aside from some deep bruises and a mild concussion, she was miraculously unharmed. They led her to their main building, a reinforced, semi-subterranean bunker hidden beneath a grove of pines. It was warm, dry, and smelled of coffee and electronics. The station chief, a man who introduced himself only as David, looked her up and down, a mixture of awe and exasperation on his face. "Major Reed," he said, having already been in frantic, encrypted communication with his own headquarters, "you've caused quite a stir." "Just doing my job," Reed replied, accepting a steaming mug of coffee. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline finally wearing off. "Your runway needs a little work," David chuckled. "We're not exactly equipped for A-10s, or blizzards, or frankly, any of this. The official story is that you experienced a catastrophic systems failure and were forced to make an emergency landing at a classified location. The paperwork is already being drafted. You'll probably get a medal and a court-martial in the same week." Reed shrugged. Wouldn't be the first time. The news that she was alive spread like wildfire in the command center at Bagram. Silence was broken by a cheer. General Wallace felt a surge of relief so intense it made him dizzy. The problem of Major Evelyn Reed was no longer a tragedy. It was now a logistical and diplomatic headache, but a headache he was profoundly grateful to have. He immediately began dispatching a rescue and recovery team, though he knew it would be days before they could even think about reaching Shade Tree through the storm. For Mako team, the news was a resurrection. Their ghost was real. She was alive. The weight of her sacrifice was lifted, replaced by a shared sense of wonder. They had witnessed something impossible, a display of skill and courage that would become a part of their team's private lore. A story to be told to new recruits to explain what true commitment looked like. Back at Shade Tree, Reed spent the next 2 days in a strange limbo. The storm continued to rage, cutting them off from the outside world. She ate with the small team of CIA operators, listened to their stories, and shared a few of her own. They were ghosts of a different kind, men who lived in the shadows, their victories and losses unrecorded. They treated her not as a rogue pilot, but as one of their own, a professional who had done what needed to be done, regardless of the rules. She spent most of her time with the wrecked A-10. She and the station's mechanic, a former Air Force crew chief, assessed the damage. It was extensive. The landing gear was shattered, the nose cone crushed, and the belly of the aircraft was deeply scored from its slide through the frozen earth. The engines, however, seemed intact, protected by their high-mounted position. The cockpit was pristine. The plane was bleeding hydraulic fluid and fuel onto the pure white snow, like a great wounded beast. "She's done," the mechanic said, shaking his head. "They'll strip her for parts and bury the rest. It'd take a miracle to get her to fly again." Reed ran a gloved hand along the fuselage, a familiar gesture of affection. "She's given me a few miracles already," she said softly. "Maybe she's got one more left in her." The idea was insane, of course. To repair a modern combat jet in the field, with limited tools, in the middle of a blizzard, was impossible. But the word impossible was starting to lose its meaning for Evelyn Reed. She had flown through an impossible storm, saved a team that was impossibly lost, and landed on a runway that was impossibly short. As the storm began to show the first signs of breaking, a new, audacious plan began to form in her mind. A plan born of desperation, stubbornness, and a deep, abiding love for the machine that had been her partner for so many years. She wasn't going to let Christine die here, in this forgotten corner of the world. She was going to fly her home. When the first rays of sun finally broke through the clouds on the third day, they illuminated a scene of quiet, determined industry. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world of pristine, glittering white, the silence broken only by the clank of metal on metal. Major Evelyn Reed, looking more like a grease-stained mechanic than a decorated combat pilot, was orchestrating one of the most audacious field repairs in modern military history. Her plan, presented to the CIA station chief David over a map, scrawled on a napkin, was simple in its objective and mind-bogglingly complex in its execution. She would not wait for a recovery team that could take weeks to arrive with heavy-lift helicopters and cranes. She would, with the help of the station's personnel and a few salvaged parts, make the A-10 airworthy enough for a single one-way flight to the nearest friendly base. David, a man accustomed to sanctioning high-risk operations, had initially dismissed it as the ravings of a concussed pilot. "Major," he had said, "this isn't a pickup truck. You can't just fix it with duct tape and baling wire." "I don't need it to be perfect," Reed had countered, her eyes burning with an intensity that brooked no argument. I just need it to hold together for about 400 miles. I need the engines to run, the control surfaces to move, and one of the landing gears to be strong enough to take off from. The key was the nose gear. It was completely destroyed. But the A-10 was famously over-engineered, a product of an era when durability trumped finesse. Reed's plan was to cannibalize parts from the two main landing gears, which were damaged but not beyond hope, and use the station's small welding torch and whatever scrap metal they could find to fabricate a makeshift, non-retractable skid. For the nose, it wouldn't be pretty, and it certainly wouldn't be safe, but it might just work. The entire CIA team, caught up in her sheer force of will, became her impromptu ground crew. They were spies and analysts, not aircraft mechanics. But they were smart, resourceful, and followed her instructions to the letter. They spent hours digging the massive aircraft out of the snowdrift, using shovels and a small front-end loader normally used for clearing the compound. They siphoned the remaining fuel, filtering it for ice crystals and contaminants. The station's mechanic, a man named Pops who had worked on F-4 Phantoms in Vietnam, became her right-hand man. He unearthed tools he hadn't touched in years and worked with a quiet, focused energy, his initial skepticism giving way to a grudging admiration for Reed's ingenuity. They used a heavy-duty winch from one of their vehicles to lift the nose of the A-10, propping it up on a stack of wooden crates. The work was brutal and cold. Fingers grew numb, tools slipped from frozen hands, but no one complained. They were part of something extraordinary. The story of the ghost pilot had already taken on mythical proportions. Encrypted messages from Bagram and beyond brought snippets of the legend. The SEALs of Mako team, now safely back at their base, had given a full debrief, their report filled with awe and gratitude. The brass, initially furious, were now in a state of bewildered amazement. The narrative was shifting. This was no longer a case of insubordination, it was becoming a tale of heroism. The pressure was on to bring Reed and her aircraft home, but the official channels were moving at a bureaucratic crawl. Reed and her makeshift team were moving at the speed of necessity. As they worked, Red learned more about the men of Shade Tree. They were the forgotten soldiers of a forgotten war, living in isolation for months at a time, their existence known only to a select few. They saw in her a kindred spirit, another ghosts operating outside the lines, defined not by regulations but by results. A bond formed in the shared hardship, a silent understanding between professionals. On the fourth day, the makeshift nose skid was complete. It was an ugly, brutalist piece of metal, a testament to pure function over form. They carefully lowered the nose of the A-10 onto it. The aircraft groaned, settled, and held. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. Next came the engines. Reed spent hours inside the massive General Electric checking turbine blades, fuel lines, and ignition systems. They seemed, miraculously, to have survived the crash without major damage. The final, and perhaps most critical task, was clearing the runway. It was still covered in a thick layer of packed snow and ice. Using their loader and shovels, the team worked tirelessly, clearing a narrow strip down the center of the runway, just wide enough for the A-10's wide wheelbase. It was a Herculean effort. By the evening of the fifth day, they were done. The A-10 sat at the end of the cleared strip, a wounded but defiant beast. Its nose was propped up on the crude metal skid. Its belly was scarred, and patches of its gray paint were scraped away, revealing the bare metal beneath. It looked like a brawler at the end of a long, bloody fight, but it was ready, or as ready as it was ever going to be. That night, a secure satellite link was established with Bagram. General Wallace appeared on the screen, his face etched with worry. "Major Reed," he began, "a combat search and rescue team is en route. They'll be there in 48 hours. I am ordering you to stand down and wait for them." Reed stood before the screen, her face smudged with grease, her flight suit torn. "With all due respect, General," she said, her voice calm and steady, "this aircraft is a sitting duck. The satellite photos that show you this runway also show it to anyone else who's looking. We've seen drone activity on the ridges. It's only a matter of time before the bad guys come to investigate the big metal bird that fell out of the sky. I'm not leaving this asset for them, and I'm not putting a CSAR team at risk coming in here to get me. Your aircraft is not airworthy." "Major," Wallace countered, his voice rising, "this is an unacceptable risk." "Every flight is a risk, General," Reed replied. "This one is just a little more obvious. I'm taking her up at dawn." There was nothing Wallace could do. He couldn't stop her. He was hundreds of miles away. a face on a screen he could only watch. He looked at the determined woman before him, at the quiet confidence in her eyes. And he knew he was witnessing a moment that would be talked about for years. "Godspeed, Major," he said finally, his voice heavy. "Warlock will be watching. We'll have a full escort waiting for you the second you cross into Afghan airspace." The dawn broke clear and cold. The air was thin and sharp. The men of Shade Tree gathered to see her off. There were no grand speeches, just handshakes, nods of respect, and quiet words of encouragement. Pops, the mechanic, gave her a small, tarnished silver Zippo lighter. "For luck," he said. "You've earned it." Reed climbed into the cockpit for what she knew would be the last time. She strapped herself in, the familiar clicks and snaps of the buckles a comforting ritual. She looked at the faces of the men who had worked alongside her, these quiet professionals who had helped her achieve the impossible. She gave them a slow, deliberate salute. Then she sealed the canopy, shutting out the world. She went through the startup sequence. The auxiliary power unit went to life. One by one, the cockpit displays flickered on. The engines spooled up with a deep, hungry roar that echoed through the valley. The old Warthog, battered and broken, was alive. She taxied slowly onto the narrow, icy runway. The nose skid scraped and groaned, an ugly, unnatural sound. She pushed the throttles to the firewall. The twin engines screamed, and the A-10 began to move, slowly at first, then gathering speed with a terrifying momentum. The runway was too short. The air was too thin at this altitude. The plane was damaged. Every law of physics said this should not work. The end of the runway rushed towards her. The plane felt sluggish, heavy. It didn't want to fly. "Come on, Christine," Reed whispered, her hands firm on the controls. "Come on, girl, one more time." She pulled back on the stick. The nose lifted, the ugly skid leaving the ground. The main wheels followed. For a heart-stopping moment, the plane hung in the air, just feet above the snow, refusing to climb. Then, as it cleared the end of the runway, it dipped into the valley, trading altitude for airspeed. It worked. The plane accelerated, and slowly, painfully, it began to climb. It clawed its way into the sky, a wounded bird fighting for its life. From the ground, the men of Shade Tree watched, holding their breath. The A-10 cleared the far ridge of the valley by what looked like mere inches. Then it banked south, towards home, a solitary, scarred silhouette against the rising sun. Evelyn Reed was airborne, but her ordeal was far from over. She was flying a crippled jet, with no landing gear, into friendly airspace that was now on high alert, waiting for the arrival of the Ghost. The flight from Shade Tree was the loneliest 400 miles of Evelyn Reed's life. The A-10, Christine, flew with a wounded, unsteady gait. The makeshift nose skid created a terrible drag, causing the aircraft to yaw constantly to one side. She had to maintain constant pressure on the rudder just to keep it flying straight. The wind whistled through cracks in the damaged fuselage, a constant mournful reminder of the jet's fragility. There was no room for error. Every input had to be gentle, precise. Any sudden maneuver could overstress the already weakened airframe and tear the plane apart. Her world was the drone of the engines, the hiss of the wind, and the green glow of the instrument panel. She was a surgeon nursing a critical patient, a rider guiding a mortally wounded horse on its final journey home. An hour into the flight, she crossed the border into Afghanistan. "Warlock, this is Ghost 1-1, she transmitted, her voice raw with fatigue. "I am in your airspace." The response was immediate, a chorus of relieved voices flooding the channel. "Ghost 1-1, solid copy. Welcome home. We have you on radar. You have a flight of 2 F-16s off your left wing." Reed looked out her canopy. Two sleek, deadly Vipers were sliding into formation alongside her. The pilots gave her a slow, respectful wave. They were her escort, her honor guard. They had been scrambled from Bagram the moment she took off, their mission to protect her from any potential threats and to visually assess the damage to her aircraft. The lead F-16 pilot, Calcine Viper 1, came up on her frequency. "Ghost 1-1, Viper 1, ma'am. That is one hell of a field repair. How's she flying?" "Like a brick with wings, Viper," Reed replied, a faint smile touching her lips for the first time in days. "But she's flying." The presence of the escort was a profound comfort. She was no longer alone in the vast, empty sky. The final leg of the journey was a slow, tense procession. The F-16s flew a protective cocoon around the lumbering A-10. News of her approach had spread throughout the command structure. At Bagram Airfield, a crowd was gathering at the edge of the flight line. Pilots, ground crews, controllers, even General Wallace himself stood in the cold morning air, their eyes scanning the southern sky. They were waiting to witness the end of the legend. The final challenge was the landing. With no functional landing gear, a normal approach was impossible. The only option was a belly landing, a controlled crash. It was an incredibly dangerous maneuver, one that pilots practiced in simulators but prayed they would never have to perform in reality. The risk of the aircraft cartwheeling, catching a wing, and exploding in a ball of fire was terrifyingly high. The Bagram fire crews coated the main runway with a thick layer of foam, creating a white carpet designed to reduce friction and suppress sparks. Ambulances and emergency vehicles stood by, their lights flashing silently. The entire base held its breath. Ghost 1-1, you are cleared to land, runway 30. The tower controller said, his voice professionally calm, belying the tension in the air. The field is yours. Emergency services are standing by. Roger, Tower, Reed replied. Her own voice was a mask of calm. Inside her heart was pounding. She had come so far, she couldn't fail now. She lined up the A-10 on a long, shallow, final approach. The F-16s peeled away, leaving her alone for the final act. She talked to the plane, her voice a low murmur in the cockpit. Okay, Christine, this is it. Easy does it. Just a little slide. We've done worse. She flew the approach with meticulous precision, her eyes locked on the end of the runway. She had to set it down, gently, perfectly aligned, with the wings absolutely level. She'll cut the power to the engines, and the A-10 began to sink. The roar of the jets replaced by the eerie whistle of the wind over the wings. The ground rushed up to meet her. The moment of impact was surprisingly soft. The scarred belly of the Warthog kissed the foam and the plane began to slide, like a massive grey toboggan. Foam flew everywhere, obscuring her vision. The sound was a deafening, grinding shriek of tortured metal. The plane stayed straight. The wings stayed level. It slid for what seemed like an eternity, shedding speed, before finally, with a weary groan, it came to a stop in the center of the runway, surrounded by a sea of white foam. Silence, then the sound of fire trucks and emergency vehicles racing towards the motionless aircraft. The canopy hissed open. Evelyn Reed, silhouetted against the sky, unstrapped herself and stood up in the cockpit. And then, a sound started to build from the edge of the flight line. It began as a few scattered claps, then grew into a roar of applause. A thunderous, heartfelt ovation from hundreds of airmen who had come to witness her return. They were applauding not just the pilot, but the sheer, indomitable spirit she represented. General Wallace walked out onto the runway, his boots sinking into the foam. He stopped at the wing of the wrecked A-10 and looked up at the woman in the cockpit. The anger was gone. The frustration was gone. All that was left was a profound, overwhelming sense of respect. Major Reed, he said, his voice carrying in the sudden quiet. That was the finest piece of flying I have ever seen in my life. Reed, bruised, exhausted, and emotionally drained, simply nodded. She had done it. She had brought her plane home. The aftermath was a whirlwind. Reed was whisked away for a medical evaluation. The A-10 tail number 810964, Christine, was carefully lifted from the runway and taken to a hangar. It would never fly again. Its final mission was complete. The official story was, as David had predicted, one of heroic piloting in the face of catastrophic mechanical failure. There was no mention of an unauthorized flight, a condemned aircraft, or a clandestine CIA base. Major Evelyn Reed was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for her actions in saving SEAL Team Mako. There was no court-martial. Her pending retirement papers were quietly approved. A few weeks later, just before she was scheduled to fly home, to a quiet life in civilian clothes, she visited the hangar where the A-10 was being stored. The plane was a shell, stripped of its engines, its cannon, its avionics. It was a ghost of its former self. Taped to the shattered canopy was a small, hand-drawn patch. It was the insignia of SEAL Team 3. The Mako shark pinned to the patch was a note. It read, "To the ghost, you are always welcome on our flank." Mako. Reed touched the patch, a lump forming in her throat. Her official career was over. The logbooks would be closed, but her legacy was just beginning. The story of the ghost of the Zagros, the pilot who flew a phantom jet through an impossible storm to save men she had never met, would be told and retold. It would become a part of the fabric of the Air Force and the Special Operations community, a benchmark for courage, a testament to the stubborn, unbreakable bond that exists between warriors. She was no longer just Major Evelyn Reed, A-10 pilot. She was a legend, a ghost in the machine, who, for a few desperate days, had reminded everyone what it truly meant to fly, to fight, and to refuse to leave anyone behind. The sky had been her home, and in its most violent moment, it had revealed her truest self. She turned and walked out of the hangar, leaving the broken warthog behind, stepping out of the shadows and into the sunlight of a future she had earned, one impossible mile at a time.